Hey everyone, I wanted to do kind of a reaction to Matty Healy from the 1975 talking on the Doomscroll podcast. I saw a clip of this the other day on Instagram and thought it was super fascinating, where he was talking about the author, teacher, philosopher, music critic Mark Fisher, and just the idea of culture, lost futures, and basically where music can go or is not going. Love him or hate him, Matty Healy I think is a really interesting artist. I like his band a lot, and I really like him as a thinker, especially when it comes to art, music, movies. Definitely has excellent taste, and yeah, just kind of wanted to go through and kind of break down some of my thoughts on what he said in part of this podcast.
Progressive flattening of culture
Yes.
is what Fisher talks about. And again, for my fans, let me just give like a really obvious example. If I said to anybody the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, the first thing that you would think of is the cultural producers of those times. 50s rock and roll, 60s hippies, 70s disco and punk, 80s rave and a new rave into rave.
My pushback, not to like jump ahead already, but I've seen a little bit of this. My pushback on you can cleanly categorize decades by genre. I think we can do this in hindsight. We also kind of, I don't know if I'm using this term right, retcon just a lot of music from the past. There's a reason why we do not remember or talk about the bad music from those eras. It's because, one, it was bad music, and two, it was longer ago. Yeah, we'll talk about like stupid music that came out 10 years ago in 2024, but we're not talking about, oh, hey, the 2000s, remember that one-hit wonder? Like, no one really does that anymore. And I think the further away you get from an era, the more people kind of forget about those things. But generally speaking, yes, I do think, yeah, you can sum up each decade by a new movement of music.
Stuff like that. They were so overtly articulate in their time, in who they were.
Yes.
And even if you look at compilations of the 90s of films where people go, it's the 90s, baby.
Yeah.
We knew kind of where we were. If you say, what was the sound of 1974? Or what was the sound of 1984? You can normally figure that out. You can almost track that to the month.
Yeah.
Whereas if I said, what's the sound of 2009?
A lot fuzzier.
It's a lot fuzzier, right? And Fisher says that it's one of the issues is that when we got to the 2000s, culture stopped feeding us this idea that a future was ever going to come.
That's a good point. I will say there were musicians in the 2000s who were thinking about the future, but usually for them, the future was pretty bleak. So I'm thinking Boards of Canada, especially with Gio Gaddy. It was being made during the time of 9/11, and that shows up completely where, yeah, we think of the future with the synthesizers and Kraftwerk and all of that. But it's using those tools to create just a dystopian nightmare, essentially. Same with Kid A, also, where it's envisioning the future, but it's not the future you want. Generally speaking, though, yeah, the bands from the early 2000s that were really big, especially in New York, and no shade to any of those groups, you could still place a lot of their sounds and ideas back into the past.
It got to the 2000s, and the biggest artists from that time were Amy Winehouse and Adele. And they were doing versions of the 60s.
Yes.
So what Fisher said was like, look, if you took a piece of music from the 90s, if you took a piece of Aphex Twin back 30 years.
Oh my God.
Could
you imagine?
It would reimagine.
People wouldn't know what to do with themselves if that happened. I mean, yeah, Aphex Twin is kind of in a league of his own. I mean, the idea of someone listening to Come to Daddy in 1964, I don't know how that would turn out.
And they would go, this isn't even music.
Right.
I am so stunned by how unrelatable this is.
Yeah.
If you took a piece of music now, even from the far left field, and you took it back to somebody 30 years, which is the 90s, and you played at them, they'd be struck by how understandable and how relatable and how not different it is.
Yes.
One of the reasons for that being that when neoliberalism and its horizonless kind of progression started to erode, any art funding started to erode, any
People do forget that, especially I believe in the 70s, from what I have read, there was a bit of funding when it came to really weird projects. David Lynch, either it was his short films or Eraserhead, he actually did get some funding for it. And it's not like, I don't know, oh, hey, it's like a nice mural that everyone can enjoy in the town kind of a thing. No, this is weird art that is going to inspire future generations, including musicians in the mainstream. Nine Inch Nails, for example, inspired by David Lynch. A lot of those really odd ideas back in the day maybe didn't gain traction within like the first few years after they came out. They were a lot of times extremely profound on following generations.
Where a squat or a rave or anything truly culturally generative could happen, it flattened what art is like. That is partially an issue to do with economics, but it's also to do with physical technologies disappearing. Very simply, the 60s, Jimi Hendrix and the overtly distorted guitar, okay? The 70s, Brian Eno and the synthesizer. The 80s, kind of the Fairchild, you know, with Peter Gabriel and Throbbing Gristle. And then the 90s, Aphex Twin and the DAW, and basically Logic and Pro Tools. Now, in music, a DAW, which is a platform where you can create music on your computer, there has been no new physical technologies.
It's all software.
Everything is software and everything is codified and everything.
The physical component is important, but you also have to remember too, with DAWs, it makes things very accessible, which I'm not for gatekeeping when it comes to making music and production or anything like that. But I would also say that if people don't know how to use or manipulate tools, a lot of times people will just treat it as almost like a digital tape recorder rather than treating it like something where you can kind of explore new sonic worlds, which you certainly can do in DAWs. But yeah, I do get kind of what he's getting at though.
In a screen. Now, if you look at the story of like when Throbbing Gristle moved to Psychic TV and Sleazy went off to do Coil. When he started Coil, he was a young person and he was part of a culture where young people were literally thinking, because they could economically and stuff like that, I don't know if I want to start a band because I don't know how it could be new. There's nothing physically new that can make.
Yeah, that's not at all how people think about wanting to become a musician today. They don't turn it down because, well, I don't know what I can do that's new when it comes to art. They're turning it down because, well, I don't know if I can make money from it, or I don't know if I will be able to have any financial security when it comes to that. But it's usually never the lack of creating something original. That's, I highly doubt that that's the case, why people would stop making music or forming bands today.
So I think that one of the problems that we have with the stagnation is that the revolution of music has only happened in the space of distribution. It hasn't happened in the space recently of creation.
Well, I do think that he's correct when it comes to physical technology not advancing has made experimentation less approachable. I kind of have a hard time even saying that because you can do so many experimental things with DAWs. People are making plugins and software that radically change how we approach music. And there are musicians out there using those DAWs that are creating things that you cannot really comprehend or compare. Top 4 examples I can think of musicians where, hey, you're using new digital technology, but you are completely changing the sounds of everything, would be Low, especially with their last 3 records. I would say Nicolas Jarre, especially his solo work. I would also say One O Tricks Point Never. And then lastly, I would say indie stot. I think, yeah, there are examples of musicians who are just on the outer edge creating these things, but the problem is they're not getting in front of people's faces, and it's not their fault. It's culture kind of just isn't ready for that. And because of digital technology and echo chambers and such, people aren't finding these things either. I know tons of people had said back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Korn had selected Come to Daddy to play on MTV, it just melted so many people's brains because they're like, wow, they put this in front of my face and I've never heard this kind of music before. We don't really have the same thing like that now because all of our feeds and algorithms are so fine-tuned to just be things that we expect and things that are a lot more palatable and enjoyable, that they aren't really changing how we interact with music and art. So I think I'll leave it there. Really like the thoughts that Matty and Joshua bring up. And I would encourage you guys to listen to this if you are just interested in the topics of music, culture, art, and how they have to do with the changing future of things, or unfortunately, in a lot of cases with what they're talking about now, just kind of recycling the past. Very interesting stuff.